$44 billion. That's how much of Vietnam's money was stolen from right under their noses. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. In this video, we'll be discussing how one Vietnamese businesswoman managed to weasel her way through Vietnam's legal system and drain the entire country of 3% of its GDP. We'll be going over every detail of this massive scandal throughout the video, so stick around until the very end to find out just how deep it goes. Who is Truong My Lan? The story starts with a Sino-Vietnamese woman by the name of Truong My Lan. Born in the hustle and bustle commerce of Ho Chi Minh City, Truong My Lan hit the ground running when it came to business. Truong My Lan started to climb up to the top of the food chain as a simple market stall vendor, selling cosmetics with her mother. After saving up most of their profits, she began investing in land and property. These properties would appreciate over time and pave the way to her personal success. By the 1990s, she went from selling makeup in market stalls to owning hotels and restaurants all over Vietnam. Her portfolio grew so large that she eventually started her own private real estate firm that dealt with luxury properties like offices, hotels, and even shopping centers. This real estate firm was called the Van Phat Group. Now let's pause for a minute here and assess just how problematic this actually is. Owning land and properties is a natural thing in any other country, and most billionaires today consider owning land one of the biggest investments you can make for the long term. This would be normal if it weren't for the fact that Vietnam's communist state means that all land in Vietnam is officially state-owned. Any person that wants to privately own land in Vietnam needs the right connections to initiate a purchase in the first place. In other words, corruption. By 2011, Truong My Lan's portfolio would increase, as with the help of her connections, she would be allowed to handle the merger of 3 smaller banks into a single large entity, the Saigon Commercial Bank. Established in 2012, the Saigon Commercial Bank, SCB for short, is one of Vietnam's largest banks by assets. Or at least it was, until this whole controversy blew up. The SCB came from the merger of 3 bankrupt banks, all owned by Truong My Lan. It's also important to note that these 3 original banks went bankrupt when Truong My Lan made some shady investment decisions, all of which involved Truong My Lan's Van Phat Group, causing shareholders to pull out in fear. So not only is this merger a good move because all assets were now centralized, but it was also a good move to not let Truong My Lan have all the power since the SCB would now be incorporated. As time passed, the SCB slowly leveled out and grew into an honest and respectable bank that could be trusted by the Vietnamese masses. This is all thanks to a law in Vietnam which prohibits any single individual from holding more than 5% of a bank's shares, meaning no shareholder would have greater control over a bank at any point. No major control from Truong My Lan? No problem. But you should never underestimate the powers of greed, and Truong's is a whole different breed. Between 2018 and 2022, Truong started investing in and purchasing shares of the bank through different shell companies, prompting the bank to lend out money to these banks. These shell companies were made to look completely legitimate and separate from Truong, but only in name. This meant that while on the books, the SCB was loaning out money to different companies, all the money was just going to Truong My Lan's pockets. Truong My Lan's husband was also complicit in this crime, often using part of the money to provide for their family and afford luxurious trips and gifts. After some thorough investigation, she reportedly transferred the money to 483 individuals and 450 legal entities. Now, with all the money being loaned, you may be wondering how long SCB was able to stay afloat with so much in receivables. Truong bypassed this by simply using a portion of the money she loaned, using one company to partially repay the loan of a different company. This endless loop of loaning and never repaying caused an infinite loop of debt that you could only see if you took a closer look at the books. But fraud of this scale can hide forever. Cracks showing. At this point, things were going well for Truong My Lan. The SCB was doing well, and no one was batting an eye. That is, until greed took a tighter hold. By November 2023, the SCB started selling higher interest rate savings deposit accounts to their customers. Bank employees would promise their customers savings deposit accounts, but in actuality, these were risky corporate bond purchases. Upon realizing this, the customers demanded to meet with executives to take their money back, but they all just got passed around with no clear answer on the refund. After a few more months of stalling, the SCB soon announced that no, they will not be responsible for handling the refund of these purchased bonds. This sent the customers into a frenzy, claiming that the SCB was selling them falsely advertised banking products, a frenzy so loud that the State Bank of Vietnam took notice. It's under this scrutiny that the real state of SCB was put to light. Trial and verdict. After some thorough investigation by the authorities, Chung My-lan took out an estimated $44 billion in loans from the Saigon Commercial Bank. This $44 billion accounted for a little over 3% of Vietnam's GDP. At this point, Chung My-lan had the net worth of a small island. Of course, the entirety of Vietnam now had eyes staring daggers into her, and this led to one of the biggest court hearings of all time. 2,700 witnesses were summoned to testify against the scrutiny of 10 state prosecutors and 200 lawyers, all of which were called by Vietnam to dig a truong-shaped hole in the ground. Evidence was literally stacked against Chung My-lan. Chung My-lan wasn't the only person to be on trial for this. Her and her 85 other accomplices were all put on trial as well. These accomplices received far more lenient charges than Chung My-lan, ranging from life in prison to a measly 10 years, depending on the degree of their involvement. The court's verdict in this trial was for Chung My-lan to pay a total of $27 billion in damages. Not exactly pocket money, and not something that Chung My-lan could easily pay back in one go. Even the prosecutors themselves were scratching their heads, thinking of ways how Chung My-lan could possibly even pay this amount back. The fact that this information is so available to us right now is nothing short of a miracle considering the tight lips of Vietnam's Communist Party. But with the degree of the crime, it seems that the Communist Party is using Chung My-lan to send a message to any other corrupt officer as part of their Blazing Furnaces anti-corruption campaign. So the courts took a heavy-handed approach in one of the most surprising verdicts of all time for a fraud case, the death sentence by lethal injection. This verdict was made on April 11, 2024. Of course, Chung was given the chance to plead her case, but the question now is how? Liquidation. The first bargaining chip that Chung has in her bag is the 1,122 assets she listed as collateral for all of her loans. These assets could be liquidated by SBC and used as partial compensation for her damages. While 1,122 asset collaterals are nothing to scoff at, these collaterals still couldn't put a dent on the $27 billion in damages the court is requesting. Aside from these collaterals, the SCB now has direct access to many of the assets that Chung directly and indirectly owns. These assets include the 1,237 properties in and around Ho Chi Minh City. People who have benefited from Chung's crimes have also been traced and will now be required to pay them back if able. As for SCB, the bank that enabled this large-scale fraud to happen in the first place, they have definitely seen better days. As soon as the news broke out of the embezzlement case, shareholders immediately pulled out of the company, sending the company's stock value into a free fall. Considering many bystanders were victimized by this case, the Vietnamese government is still actively trying to dig SCB out of bankruptcy. Today, Chung is still in a race against time to pay off her damages. Only time will tell if she'll be able to raise the funds or pay for it with her most valuable asset, her life.